Well, thank you. After this very informative, very interesting first round, I think, so have been observing some of you say, oh yes, indeed, is that so? Well, I think you all more or less learned at least some new issues and got some more components for your internal puzzle, so to say. And I think after having stepped in this information, from this information point, I think it's now time to think about the what, in terms of what needs to be done. And therefore we have prepared a panel of experts which will expand further on the complex issue of marine litter here, and they will particularly focus on 4 main issues under the heading of, as I said, what. I now have the honor to introduce the panelists actually, and due to the fact that I did not see all of them actually, I would just like to, well, briefly introduce, and then the respective person and colleague come to the panel please and take his/her seat there. The first on my list is Miss Bobo Remijn, who is currently working for the European Commission as a policy officer in the Transport Department, DG Move there. In her capacity, right now she's responsible for the EU Directive on Port Reception Facilities for Ship-Generated Waste, as well as the EU Directive on Ship Source Pollution. So, Ms. Bobo Remijn, if you could please, okay, welcome. And please take a seat on the panel. Thanks for that. The second one is I can now, after this first hour, already say a good friend. This is Peter Kershaw again. He has already been introduced, still being responsible for GESAMP as well. Peter, may I invite you as well? Thank you. The third, a lady again, and Peter, Peter should not feel alone, actually. I mean, there will be 2 other ladies, including the moderator. It will be hard times for you, but I'm sure you will stand that. The third now on this panel is Ms. Saijariina Toivikko. She is Senior Advisor at the Finnish Water Utilities Association, FIWA, and at the same time member of the Wastewater Commission of the European Federation of National Associations of Water Services, in brief, EurEau. Saijariina Toivikko, sorry for that, welcome. Last but not least, and that is the name that is more fluently, because it's a German colleague, is Stefanie Werner. She is since 2008 now already working as a scientific officer for the protection of the marine environment in the German Federal Environment Agency. One of her focus of work concerns solution strategies to combat marine litter. Stefanie, may I also invite you to take a seat on the panel. The idea of this session now is, or of the next, let's say, 5 minutes all in all, to create a link. And I don't think it's an artificial one, it's a quite natural link between what we have learned in the first round now and what your contribution, you 4 experts' contribution, is to the issue of fighting marine litter. And for that, I mean, you have been very carefully listening, of course, to the information that has been given to you in the 4 corners of the room, actually. I would like to ask each of you to give us just a first impression, a very brief impression, actually, around 40 seconds. That is what I've been told here, so you're probably talking about a minute. What is your impression? What is, let's say, the highlight, maybe, from this first round of information which we have undergone during the last, 60 minutes now. May I start with you, Anna, just to give us a brief view? And if you would please be so kind just to stand up so that people can see you, that we have an impression of who is talking and what is behind. Thank you.
Yes, hello, and hello to you all. So there are 4 very interesting presentations. I've been paying particular attention to the ones addressing the sea-based sources of marine litter, including shipping and the fishing sector. So I wanted to share some of my impressions on those sessions here with you. So it seemed from the discussions, presentations, that the main potential in reducing waste from ships and fishing would be by improving the reception in ports. First, by application of better application of the waste legislation, in particular the waste hierarchy, by better defining adequacy of facilities, what does it mean, and auditing of facilities to receive MARPOL Annex 5 waste, and then also important to improve statistics on waste streams imports. Then on the other side, the focus was on how to improve onboard generation, so also the efforts of ships to reduce the waste generation on board. This could be done by developing better the green ship concept of ships, and also, of course, better enforcement of the MARPOL Annex 5 discharge norms or prohibitions. And then lastly, one of the issues also came up was the fee systems, very important in also reducing the waste discharge into the sea, and especially in the Baltic region. And there's a clear need to clarify further the balance between the indirect and direct fee elements, and also to find ways on how to best include fishing vessels into the scheme, or how to redesign the system in such a way that litter which is fished at sea can be delivered on shore for free. That is it from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much for giving us your impression and your brief summing up, so to say. Peter, may I take it that ladies first, so that you have the opportunity of wrapping up the ladies' contributions?
So sorry for that. Yeah. Well, I think thank you very much for very interesting presentations. I think they were very inspiring, since I found that there is really a lot of good examples already that what can be done with this problem what we had, and it became also quite clear that we have a challenge, we have the problem. I think it made it very clear that there needs to be basic infrastructure in place. So we need to have waste management working well. We need to have wastewater treatment plants in place and working. But a part of that, it was very interesting to see that actually NGOs have been able to create a lot of activity, a lot of really good measures, and really working with this challenge efficiently. So it seems to be that we need both this public sector and NGOs working together to get good results.
Thank you for this view. And Stefanie, the third lady, and then the gentleman wrapping up.
Yes, thank you. So, yeah, I have the feeling from all what we heard in the morning that attention on the marine litter issue is really on a recent rise, whether in the European context or in the global context. And so I think it's really great that we meet here today to really speed up the implementation of the HELCOM Regional Action Plan and develop concrete measures out of these quite broad fields of actions which are defined in the plan. I think this needs to be done, and that became quite clear from the presentations as well, in cooperation with other regional sea conventions, because also the sources differ in terms of amounts they contribute to the overall marine litter issue. We more or less have the same top findings and also for regional seas. And so I think we really can learn and make use of the knowledge which is actually gathered in other settings. So for example, OSPA is right now already compiling info and best practice in the fishing sector, and has initiated an action to combat dolly ropes. And at the other hand side, HELCOM has had very actively with the WWF doing removal activities on ghost nets with more than 350 tons already removed. So it's really a lot of lessons learned already from all sides. And also, of course, we need to involve third parties, which are probably not in the room today, but which we need for certain sectors, such as the FAO, UNEP or IMO for the fishing-related issues, which I was asked to get a bit more into today. So yeah, and I think a particular challenge emanates from the fishing sector in terms of abandoned, lost and otherwise discarded fishing gear, with 10,000 gill nets being lost in the Baltic Sea annually alone. which is a real threat to marine biodiversity and which needs a huge stakeholder involvement to really combat that. But I think we come to more detailed solution strategies a little bit later in that panel. So I leave us with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefanie. Last but not least, Peter. And it was not only the ladies' first approach, I can tell you now, it was also, there's a kind of different position, I think, for you. You have been one of the presenters in one of the corners, so you did not have the opportunity to walk around. And so it's not fair to ask you what was your impression of the other three corners.
Well, I'm going to make use of the excellent summaries given.
That's exactly the point. So you have a kind of freestyle presentation now, the 40 seconds. What is your message?
Right, okay. Well, what was interesting is what I've read and what I've heard about HELCOM marine litter activities fits well with the sort of international approach being developed through, particularly at the moment, through UNEP and something I'm involved with, preparing a study for the United Nations Environment Assembly, which will be meeting in May. And I would like to make 5 overall comments, if I may make, which I think are relevant. One is, I think, I would emphasize the need to take a risk-based approach, that when you're identifying sources and pathways, the socio-economic context, the stakeholder groups that need to be involved, the intervention points, because that then helps set priorities and targets interventions and make sure that they're cost-effective. So that risk-based approach is important. Clearly, it's a multifaceted problem, and it's as much a question of human dimension as technical problems. So, you need, for example, you need to understand people. You need to work with behavioral psychologists, behavioral scientists. You need to understand why people do what they do. Expect local, national, regional differences in sources and in pathways and in impacts and in measures, because clearly not one size is going to fit, even with a region which is relatively small, like Baltic. I favour I call it the carrot and stick approach. That's probably a British expression. It means if you have a donkey, you could dangle a carrot in front of it to encourage it, or you could hit it with a stick behind. In other words, you should encourage and require. Mm-hmm. So it's a two-phase approach. And then we go back to what are now the 6 R's, which are redesign, reduce, remove, reuse, recycle, and recover energy. So in other words, going towards a circular model. And that's an ideal, and you have to take lots of little steps on the way there. But that's a nice sort of platform to have. I think we have to be precautionary as well. There's a need to be precautionary in this. Even if we haven't quantified all the impacts, we know enough to act.
Thank you, Peter. And unfortunately, as expected, a different approach, as a matter of fact, as I said in the intro, but I think a very complementary approach in just focusing on strategic issues, on strategic aspects which we need to bear in mind as a kind of heading when structuring the process of fighting litter and when, well, trying to divide and subdivide the tasks which we have to tackle. Okay, I mean, concluding here, it's definitely not a surprise, but a good experience, of course, that the 4 just gave us, of course, a good overview of what are the very different, but nevertheless the large amount of particular issues we need to bear in mind, we need to tackle, we need to be aware of, whatever, at least which we have to have in mind. And I mean, to put it in simple wording now, I may quote a former HELCOM chairperson, I don't mention the name, who regularly in a case like that said, oh, there is a large variety of issues around the table. That's actually, I would say, with an exclamation mark, what we can sort out so far. And what we can only link to that is, and my impression was when just having a look here and there, that the variety of stakeholders being present here corresponds with the requests and the challenges that have been presented in this round here. But the 40 seconds or 1 minute and 40 seconds we had so far from our colleagues here, I think that is definitely not enough to give you an impression of what they really do and what their a personal link, so to say, or of course a business/personal link to the issue of marine litter is, and therefore we have asked the 4 panelists to prepare in advance, of course, by surprise, now they are prepared, a presentation or a statement, whatever, and explain in 2 minutes their main message to the audience. And now please distinguish, the first round now was just recalling what we all together have learned and seen in the first round. Now we step over into the proactive part of those colleagues sitting there. What is their message? What is their idea? What do they want to spread into the audience here? And now we receive the proactive input, so to say, from our 4 colleagues. And this time I do not mix the order because there is no need for that. Actually, we will start with the European Commission, with Anna, and then go along colleagues as they sit there. That might be the easiest way. So Anna, again, you have the floor, you have the microphone, you have everything you want. Please.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad to do the 2 minutes. Given my professional background, I will focus on the sea-based sources of marine litter for the ships and the fishing sector. Seems to be on. Yeah. So, hope my 2 minutes only start now. So, I will focus on the sea-based sources of marine litter, shipping, fishing sector, in particular the role that Directive 2059 EC can play in this, the Directive on Port Reception Facilities, which has also been recognized in the recently adopted circular economy package of the Commission as having great potential to reduce the marine litter from these sources. The Port Reception Facilities Directive aims at reducing discharges of waste from ships at sea by first improving availability of adequate port reception facility and second to improve the use of such port reception facilities. The directive includes certain provisions on adequacy, defining that by looking at the operational conditions and also the environmental conditions, which includes the implementation of EU waste legislation. And one of the important tools is the development of waste reception and handling plans, which the Commission sees as instrumental for achieving adequacy. The other pillar of the directive is the mandatory delivery of ship-generated waste to port reception facilities. And here it's important to note that the directive actually goes beyond the MARPOL Convention by requiring that all waste be delivered to ports, except when there is sufficient storage capacity on board of ships. And also it's important to have an effective enforcement of this provision. The directive also provides for other incentive measures to make sure that, for instance, cost recovery systems provide no incentive to discharge waste at sea by ensuring that a significant contribution from ships is made irrespective of actual delivery. And the directive also provides certain provisions on the green ship concept. Now, the Commission has recently embarked on an impact assessment process for revision of the directive, where it will assess various options to, on the one hand, improve the adequacy of the facilities and the way that the waste is managed in these facilities, and second, improve delivery of waste to these facilities through a more effective and perhaps targeted inspections, and also better application, a more uniform system of the cost recovery, application of the cost recovery systems. The options that we will look at in the impact assessment will also cover specific measures to address the waste coming from fishing vessels, and also looking at how to support the Fishing for Litter initiatives. I would say the main message coming from us is that we see the best way to reduce sea-based sources of marine litter in a harmonized way through an effective implementation and also a future revision of the Port Reception Facilities Directive. And we invite you all to contribute to the public consultation process and stakeholder events, which will be launched soon, and in particular this year. Thank you.
We thank you, Anna, for this inside view, so to say, and a very detailed, information sheet, a fact sheet, so to say, an oral fact sheet concerning the existing regulations and the request for better implementation. That's actually what I would sum up. Thank you. Peter, you are the next now. What is your message? What is the issue you would like to deliver to the audience?
I'm dealing with microplastics. GESAMP has been running a working group for the last 2 years, produced a report last year, and we're about to produce another report on sources, fate, and effects of microplastics in the ocean. So that's my, that's where I get the information from, if you like. I'm working with a lot of experts around the world. My main messages are about prevention, because we cannot remove microplastics when they're in the system. There are some easy ways of doing it. I think, like, remove unnecessary use of microplastics in products, reduce spillage and loss by industry. Those are two images from a river, European rivers, which actually have a lot of microplastic particles in from industry. Reduce loss of textiles during washing. There are ways of doing that. There's an EU program called Mermaid working on that at the moment. Improve wastewater collection. The tyre issue, you can't stop people using tyres, but if you can try and collect water and treat it better, that's one way of doing it. Improve design and use of fishing gear. Stefanie's already mentioned that, but that's another way we can try and minimize the release. Reduce the input of microplastics. There's an awful lot of microplastics are coming from macroplastics, and it's much easier to do with macroplastics. So improved education, solid waste management and intervention measures, and remove macroplastics where you can, where it's from hotspots, where it's cost effective, where you're not going to do any more damage. So removing fishing nets, removing material from shorelines, and monitor. So monitor to target interventions and measure successive measures to make sure that they're cost effective, to make sure you're monitoring the right compartments and entry points, and preferably automate it, because otherwise it's very not cost effective at all. And I've come to the end of my time. It's not nice having that.
This is not Christmas, this is the end of the time, at least for this presentation. Thank you, Peter. Now we have Saijariina with her, well, input, request to the audience, whatever it is. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Water services use. So as we know, marine litter is originating from great variety of sources. And I think we still need more information and research, especially to identify the sources and what is the relative contribution of these sources, so that we can decide and our measures based on the reliable basis, and so we will know what will be the most efficient measures. Wastewater treatment plants are not original sources of microplastics. They are a pathway. Even though wastewater treatment plants are treating microplastic efficiently, so over 90%, but not all of them. And this is the reason we still think that the optimal solution would be that the microplastics wouldn't enter the water cycle in the first place. And that's why we want to emphasize the need for source control. And there are some measures which are quite simple ones, like this banning of microplastics in the cosmetic products. There's also new measures which we can find out through innovative research. And I believe that there are measures which we can achieve if you use communication and awareness raising as a tools. And at last, I would like to mention sustainable stormwater management, because this is something which we can use both to decrease emissions of microplastics, but also to prevent flood problems. So it's a solution where we can hit two birds with one stone. Thank you. 2 minutes. This is quite terrible.
For keeping the deadline exactly. Stefanie, last but not least,
yes,
please.
So try to speed up.
I'm
actually involved in general in strategy to combat marine litter, but the HELCOM secretary has asked me to talk about fisheries in specific, probably because I'm assisting as a scientific diver in removal operations in Germany. Maybe that was the case. So if you want to tackle marine litter from fisheries, you first have to get clear about the actual reasons why loss is abundant, why gear is lost or abundant in the marine environment. That could be from one hand, so most of the gear is not deliberately discarded, but lost through to bad weather conditions or also gear conflicts. For example, if button trawling is carried out in areas where button traps are already deployed and of other reasons. But some is also lost through deliberate activities, such as due to overcapacities or to illegal fisheries, and also to economic reasons, for example, to avoid fees in harbors, which brings me to the second point, that it has to be ensured that litter arising from fishery operations is actually covered by existing legislation. So in the terms of the fishing sector, it needs to be ensured that the 100% indirect fee, which is the no special fee system in the Baltic Sea, is really also applied on a mandatory basis for all fishing vessels in Baltic ports. And yeah, we hope also EU-wide. And as Hermione said this morning, in this case, it also has to be ensured that the waste burden is then quite fairly distributed between different ports. Once options to address key waste items has to be developed, it needs to be specified which of them are actually applied. That can be a lot of different options, starting from geomarking, provision of collection, deposit, disposal, or recycling schemes, and the other options you can see on the slide.
One last sentence.
So in terms of new technologies, for example, one can imagine GPS systems to mark location where gear is lost, and economic incentives to propose to encourage fishermen to actually bring back old, damaged and ghost gear. And the end-of-pipe solution, of course, is then the removal of ghost nets, which is already going on. And that has to be done in an environment-sound way, which is very important. So we need to concentrate on accumulation areas of floating litter. Thank you.
Welcome. You will have an additional opportunity, actually, because there will be some more program now for panelists, because it would have been a shame if we would have invited you all for those 40 seconds plus 2 minutes plus something, actually. If I try to give a very abstract, a very, meta-level summary, I would say that when going through the points, actually, what we've heard about waste delivery in ports or the port reception facilities directive, we have regulations in place. They need perhaps some updating, yes or no, don't know yet. A point which I did not hear, actually, which I would like to add personally, maybe it's also a question of raising awareness of persons concerned. I mean, the regulation is there, the implementation process cannot be monitored in the way we know that from national traffic or whatever. So maybe there is also at least a small key which we should make use of in the future. With regard to microplastics, prevention seems to be the word of the day, if I might just put it in a very brief frame now. We need source control as regards microplastics. That's what we also heard. That has very much to do with producers on the one hand, but also with consumers, I think. There's a responsibility for us as well, because clothes which we don't buy, we needn't wash them and they won't get rid of plastic fibers. Last but not least was as regards the fishing sector. The work has already started, not only by work of NGOs who are very active there. A personal addition from my side, and that is some experience from a different process we had during the last year. I think the FAO is, apart from the IMO, who's responsible, or which is responsible for the shipping issues and the sea-based component from shipping. The FAO, I think, has also a particular responsibility for what is going on in the fishing fields or the fisheries fields, because that is their industry. They are responsible for that. Let's say if we can get them on board as well. It must be a large ship in the end, whom we need on board, but let's see. I already announce that this was definitely not all with regard to our panelists here, because now we would like to dig somewhat deeper actually, and to get some more spontaneous reaction maybe from your side. And that is the typical game of questions and answers. You know, normally sitting there, this is the part where I start trembling and say, okay, what is now this thing you should answer? I don't think it's too complicated, actually. We have just tried to, well, I wouldn't say formulate tailor-made questions, but questions which could perhaps be placed best for one or two or the other, four of you, sorry. And please, I mean, I have one request to you. I will address you with one particular question, and there's a second one, and that goes for all of you, and that is actually when you look 20 years ahead from now, that would be 2036, my dear. Will marine litter then still be an issue to be tackled in the Baltic Sea? What is your prediction? That should be the last sentence of answering the question. And now I would like to start with Anna again, and the question we would like to ask you is, in your opinion, from your point of view and based on your knowledge and experience in this context, what do you think, which specific actions would be most important in tackling litter in the Baltic Sea area? Do you have at least maybe two? And why do you think those two are the most prominent ones from your point of view? And what about the same issue here 20 years ahead? Please.
So again, I will approach this from the angle of the port reception facilities, which mostly deal with the fishing and shipping sector. When I say shipping, I mean also including fishing vessels and recreational craft, which are also covered by the directive. So as I also tried to explain a bit in my presentation, I hope that has come across, for us there are two pillars which are important. One is improving the adequacy of the facilities to deal with the waste, and there we distinguish between operational conditions, which take into account port users' needs when they want to deliver, but also taking into account the size of ports and their location. These two have to be balanced, and that's difficult enough. And the other side of the adequacy discussion is how to improve the environmental conditions under which they operate, so improving the application mostly of the waste legislation. And we've heard several difficulties already discussed today on the segregation problems, where waste is segregated on board, and when it comes on land it's all thrown into one container. These are things we will need to look into also at the EU level and see how we can overcome these inconsistencies. So that's the first pillar. Then the second is that we should focus on how to improve the waste delivery to ports. Well, you can approach that from the MARPOL side, saying a discharge ban, so no discharges into the sea, how to get to that. The other side of the coin is improving waste delivery to ports and how to improve that. And from, again, the EU angle, we see the importance of the enforcement, so stepping on inspections and making inspections more efficient and targeted. And there we will look into improving clarification of sufficient storage capacity and exchange of information between national authorities. That is also extremely important. And then the other part is the incentive measures, as we call them, which also includes the cost recovery system. So for us, these are the two things where we will be looking in improving things for the future. Whether there will be any marine litter in how many years from now? 20 years from now. Again, this will very much depend on how seriously this issue is taken at the regulatory level, but also involving all the stakeholders. As you said, awareness raising is very important in that respect, and everybody working together in taking this seriously and doing the necessary to address this. And that the future will tell. I mean, at the EU level, we are working hard implementing the circular economy strategy. I think that is a way of rethinking our economic model, and certainly from the very small angle of the port reception facilities, I'll try to contribute to this process.
Well, thank you, Anna, for responding both questions, actually. And I think taking seriously, that is at least the first very concrete step. No, not the first. I mean, we have this action plan, but in this and this group here with the stakeholders are not the first very serious step, which shows that we take this seriously altogether. Don't we? We do. Peter, you are the next on my list, actually. And given that you have already been working a very long time in this issue, actually, I found it a good idea maybe to bother you with the next question, and that is, please think of which specific actions against litter have not been taken yet in the region, despite the availability of sufficient knowledge, sufficient means, and or even sufficient tools. It's a tricky question, I know, but I know that I've got an expert in front of me, so.
I just prepared my answer for the first question you asked about microplastic. I feel at a disadvantage because there are some generalities about sources and actions which could be taken. And there are some specifics about the situation in the Baltic of which I know very little. What I think is important is when you talk about taking measures, is to see what, even if you can introduce a measure. So, for example, the IMO MARPOL Convention, which bans the discharge of plastics over the side of ships. That measure has been introduced, but it is not well implemented and it is not well policed. And so that is a measure which has been introduced, but the follow-up to make sure that it happens hasn't been. And it's the same with a lot of these things. So good practice so we know about loss of fishing gear. You know, we know some of the reasons why it happens, and we've known that for a long time. But there are a lot of political, economic, and social reasons why it hasn't happened. And even when it does happen, technically, from a practical point of view, if there isn't acceptance by all those people involved, then it's not a waste of time, but it's not as effective as it might be. I'm dodging your question, but I think that's important to bear in mind, because there is sometimes a view that if you pass some legislation to say you should or shouldn't do this, you somehow have solved the problem. And I think very often, I think we have to be much cleverer. So when we are looking, we ought to look at things which have been introduced which haven't worked or haven't worked as well as they might, and work out why, so that when you push forward for these improvements, you've got all the people who need to be around. Otherwise, because if you get, I'll be very careful, I'm a Brit at the moment and we're coming up to a referendum, but if you get a missive from a higher authority telling you to do something and you don't agree with it, and you're a fisherman, it won't happen. Yeah. Oh,
and the Baltic Sea 20 years from now? Or the marine litter in the Baltic Sea 20 years from now?
There will still be marine litter in the Baltic Sea 20 years' time, and it might be worse than it is now.
And then, as a consequence of that, there's still something that will need to be done then?
Yes.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, that's very friendly to hand the microphone over already, because the next indeed is Saijariina. Given that you are having the role of a stakeholder in this team here, I thought it might perhaps be you are the right to address you with the following questions. When thinking of the different stakeholders, and that is governance and administration, the private sector, research, consumers, and civil society as a whole, what role in practice would they need to take now in combating litter in the Baltic Sea? Which stakeholders, what do you think would have the biggest impact? And maybe you have one or two examples for that, what you give and present now as an evaluation? Please. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. It's quite obvious that everyone, all the organizations have a role in here. I would like to highlight the research sector here, because some of the issues are quite easy ones, and we know the solutions. But I think there's also some challenges, and here my eye is very much looking to the possibilities of new innovations and new developments. And just to give one example, that, for example, now we are thinking of this. We know that textiles, fabrics are one part of the microparticles, and at the same time there are some research and studies that maybe some kind of finishing treatment of textiles could help the solve problem at least partially. And we also saw that some tentative results show that car tires could be one major source. So this is something that when we really know what is the major problem, then we have the possibility to also target our research resources, especially to these problems. So I think that's something that when we have this information is important. But of course, I'm also want to raise up my own sector. So really this basic infrastructure. So of course it's very important that all our wastewater treatment plants and waste management plants are managed well, so that they are working fine and they can also are contributing to this issue.
Well, thank you. And what about the Baltic Sea marine litter issue in 20 years from now?
20 years ago, I'm confident that when we will get more information, we can make measures, and the situation will be in that sense, when we are looking at the emissions, it will decrease. And of course, when we are building or doing something new, then we can use the knowledge we have and make things better than what we have done before. So I see a lot of positive in the future in this sense. But as plastic is very permanent material in the sea environment, so I think that the plastic which is already there is something that will not get away, and that's definitely a challenge also in the future.
So the answer is yes, it will be a problem, and we will still need to
a certain extent, yes.
Thank you. Last but not least, Stefanie, indeed. Stefanie, to be brief, what could you do for getting more attention and prominence to the litter issue in the Baltic coastal countries? Try to maybe some practical advice. I mean, some ideas, first guess to get more attention and prominence for the issue of marine litter in the Baltic Sea. Some pragmatic ideas? Sure.
Well, I think the attention is coming anyway, if you look into the different levels which are approaching marine litter now. So I think if we just look back to the last 5 years, where coming from marine litter isn't an issue at all in the Baltic Sea, being now on the stage where we are, I think that is evolving. And I think what we need is a really good interconnection between stakeholders. We need a concerted approach towards for example, different industry. It makes no sense that we approach them every time from individual-wise by every regional sea, but we need to see what is there, what can we use, how can we come from there and go down the path together. And I think ongoing activities, for example, by NGOs, are already raising a lot of awareness for the issue. For example, the ghost nets we talked about already. So, and the 2063 questions, I can just echo Anna. I mean, it really depends how serious.
36, not 63. That would be a little bit too much then.
36, okay.
36, it's only 20 years.
Okay. So, I really think it depends how serious we are, how it's more or less a systematic, imminent problem. So I think we really have to get onto the issues of single-use items versus long-time applications, of giving plastic a value, of really coming probably from, I mean, we live in the Anthropocene. If you look into the sediments of the earth from the 1950s, you find everywhere loss of plastics. This is already there, and that will be there. And so I don't think we will have tackled that in a couple of years. But we can do a lot into going into prevention. We have a lot of removal activities going on, but prevention is not strong enough. So we have to look more into that side.
So if I may take the picture of or the metaphor of the glass of water, actually, it has been rather full. And if we are very positive now, say, okay, it may be 50% now, but it's definitely 50% full and not empty from our point of view. We have, well, tackled the problem already, and there's some hope that we will even improve and become better in the future. We must, no doubt about that. And then let's hope that we will come to a final result. Maybe not in 20 years from now, but 30, 40, 50. Probably most of us will have passed away if the problem will ever be solved, but that should not hinder us to contribute now and here what we can do. Fine. Well, I think we should close this, let's say, proactive input from your side now, and now to switch to the audience, to those who have been listening the whole morning. And as far as I know, there is also some Twitter input or questions or feedback, whatever. Do they damn us? Do they find us wonderful? Any questions, any statements? Johanna, you give us some enlightenment.
Yes, I'm not questions as such, I would say. There's some interesting comments, though. I could mention a few.
Yes, of course.
I don't know if we can get there's some sort of a stream. We could also see a bit of a way to show the results or the catch of the day so far. So quite a few have been posting about Peter Kershaw's microplastics main messages. Then there is bonus secretariat saying research and innovation play major roles in reducing marine litter. Also earlier, marine litter is a huge problem, but together we can be part of the solution. Also a referral to Norwegian research about how most of the microplastics is from car tires. One comment saying cost-benefit analysis of various marine litter reduction and cleanup approaches are needed. Anyway, I think also questions can be reacted to, so I'm still encouraging you to keep your active comments coming. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Johanna, for giving us this, well, view of the current situation in the Twitter world, so to say. Well, since there were no concrete questions so far, just comments, not so much surprisingly, I must say. The question is if there are questions in here, and I'm absolutely sure that you have been listening, you had to listen the whole morning so far. Now you have the opportunity to ask your questions, to make your statement, even if that is needed. A microphone will be available, so you needn't use your voice extremely loudly. You will have a microphone. All assistance you need. Please.
Thank you very much. I'm Vanessa Ryan from WWF here in Finland. Thank you to the presenters for an interesting discussion and interesting presentations as well in the small groups. And I don't know if there's actually any one of you who'd like to answer the question that I'm about to pose, but as it's become evident from all the presentations here, recycling is obviously a key to prevention of marine litter. And I was wondering, since there are so many examples in the world, for example in Japan, of these zero waste communities where recycling is taken really, really seriously, is there any research on what is kind of the optimal recycling level and how far people are willing to go? So do you have any response to that? Thank you.
Who would like to answer? I have this. Anna, please.
Just a general statement. So, of course, it's
probably down on the bottom. There, yeah. Oh, so sorry.
It's a very general statement. Is that the recycling is clear when we have to apply the waste hierarchy that this should have priority, and that's also recognized in the circular economy strategy. But on the application of the waste legislation at local level, there's still a wide margin of discretion depending on the economic and environmental conditions of the municipality or the ports in question. So on this maximum level, that's within the EU, very much still driven by local circumstances.
Peter, an amendment? And I saw some movement
with
Stefanie.
It's an interesting question, and it's quite difficult to answer, I think. There's been, if you look at the recent report from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, there's something in there which talked about recycling, trying to put a value in plastics. And even for something like PET bottles, it was only a relatively small proportion of the PET bottles which have been recycled, which were made back into PET bottles. Most of them are not of sufficient sort of quality, too contaminated. So they then went into production of clothing, the fibre, PET. And of course that then, so you recycle it, so you may have 100% recycling of PET bottles, but in fact, if you look downstream of that, you're not actually capturing it within the system. You're just delaying it, and then it's going back out into the system. And that's for something which is one of the easiest things to recycle. The other point is that when countries refer to their recycling rates, you have to be a bit careful, because there's a huge international trade in waste material. So a lot of material that's collected isn't recycled within the country. It goes particularly to Asia. And conditions there and the mixing of different waste streams when they shouldn't be, which is where you get these issues of recycled plastics used for children's toys, which have got contaminants in, because they'd be... So you have to be a bit careful with the figures. I think it's a really good thing to look at and to see what actually happens. And especially plastics used in electronics materials, a big issue there in West Africa and in India and places where you've got a lot of human health problems because of that. It's been recycled in Europe, but it's causing big problems somewhere else.
Thank you, Peter, for focusing on that and making us sensible for this particular issue, which is maybe forgotten when talking about a good recycling quota and all that, what we have achieved already, but there's something left, definitely. Stefanie, I saw your body language. There is some answer that would like to get to the outside your mouth to the audience, please.
Yeah, well, actually, Judith and me, we just been to Japan, and we saw how you can improve recycling quite easily and straightforward in terms of the PET bottles, to take that example. What the Japanese are doing, they just produce only neutral PET bottles, and they just cover them with some really thin material. And they improved the recycling of PET bottles to 50% just by that. So I think that information exchange, which is going on also on the global level, can be really, really worthwhile. And another issue I want to raise in this context is the issue of additives. The problem is that a lot of plastics contain additives, which in the end means they can be only downcycled, but not recycled or even upcycled anymore. And that's a real issue we need to target with the industry, how to solve that.
Thank you, Stefanie, for this additional remark. Bernard, may I just have an indication how many questions are left? No, it's fine. I mean, okay, there's a second one, so that I have an idea with regard to the time.
As next to my work in Waste-Free Oceans, I'm also working in the plastic recycling industry since 30 years. We can recycle PET bottles up to 100% if we have the courage to look at the way of they are being collected. So if we put a deposit scheme, we return over 95% of the bottles, and I can go from bottle to bottle recycling like for glass. If I put it in a mixed fraction, or I have to get it out of the rivers, the only choice I have, because of food legislation, is to go into other applications. And this is what we say, we have to think out of scope. We have to change the way we are collecting waste with a view of reusing it as a raw material and not to collect it for the collection to put it into an incineration or a landfill. And this is the biggest challenge you have. There is a report made by BOS, which is a Paris consultancy company on behalf of the European Commission on request of the recyclers. We think with today's technology, over 70% of the plastics put in the market can be recycled on a very high level, provided that we don't have to fight REACH issues, provided that we don't have to fight a very big mixture of waste collection by people organizing waste collection with not the intention of recycling plastics. So we can do much more, but we need some bold political decisions.
Thank you for that. That was not too optimistic, but I think it was just a piece of realism, which we sometimes need to come down to earth again. I hope it's not too realistic now from your side, but I mean, facts and figures. This is also a message of this conference here. Please, you have a question? At least you had one 2 minutes ago.
Hi,
could you just introduce yourself, please?
Yes,
I mean,
Marie Love from the Stockholm University Baltic Sea Center. When we're talking about secondary microplastics, as Peter mentioned in the good presentation that you had, it's a big difference depending on the kind of type of plastic. And it's a lot focused now, both in the Norwegian report and in the Swedish national report on microplastic sources that it just has been released on tire particles. But what is your opinion on how far are they transported? Is it more a local thing, or is it actually a big issue for the Baltic Sea?
I'm not going to give a direct answer because I don't know. I started to look at, this is why you need a group of people with different backgrounds, because, and it's something we might take up if our GESAMP working group on microplastics has another year to run. And so it's one of those issues which we might take up, and then we'll get people in who know about the composition of car tires, who know, because they're complex things. They've got lots of different types of rubber in, they've got lots of additives, they have carbon black put in, they have a whole host of things put in. So it's a complicated mixture you're dealing with. So how each of those components is going to work and how they're bound together and so forth. But it's a really important thing. But like I was saying, this is an issue that's been going on since we've had rubber car tires, but it's only something which has come up very, very recently as a potentially a major source wherever you have transport. And so it's clearly a really priority area for research, but you've got to get the right people in, because one of the things I have discovered with the best will in the world, if you don't have people with the right background expertise, everyone makes assumptions about how things are, what's important, how things behave, etc., etc. So you have to bring in people who know about car tires, who to add to the mix, people who know about wastewater treatment and so forth. So I think GESAMP will try and address that one in the coming year. So I can't answer the question. Maybe next year.
Thank you, Peter. And maybe, Stefanie, from your point of view, some add-on?
Yeah, just to add on that, within OSPA there is an ongoing activity on microplastics. Different countries have came up with studies on the amounts of primary microplastics used in different applications, but also predictions for secondary microplastics, which led to a conference in November in Rotterdam, actually, where the paint industry, the tire industry was present, which was really, really great, because they were sitting there and they said, we always thought we are the solution, and now, in one instant we are the problem, and it's a really great dialogue which is ongoing, and I think we should make in HELCOM and other fora really making use of these ongoing and really existing connection to the industry already.
What I just heard was another version of the hen and the egg. First of all, we had a solution, now we have a problem again. Fine. Other questions, additional questions, or statements, or whatever from the floor? Silva, please.
Thank you. My name is Silver Vahtra, and I'm coming from Estonian Ministry of Environment. And first hand, to get rid of car tires, make cars fly. And what is really bothering me, we are not talking here, is the source of this microplastic. We are dealing with the end of a product production when it clearly becomes waste. But the waste is created after production. It is already waste. And that brings us to the consumerism. Perhaps this is something we need to tackle with. What do you think? Thank you.
Thank you, Silva. Did you have anybody particular in mind?
No.
So, volunteers first. Stefanie, you would also like to contribute?
I didn't get the core of the question. Maybe you...
Okay, but I think Peter got so...
I'm not sure I understood the question, so forgive me. But you were talking about there should be more emphasis on the source before it becomes... Consumerism. Yes. I mean, the 6 R's, which are referred to, I mean, which is redesign. So you don't, you redesign the product so either it's easy to recycle or to reuse, or you use less material, and so on and so forth, is one way of doing it. What's the next R? There's reuse. There's reduce the amount of material, so you can make things lighter or use less material. You can, what's the next one? I got them written, I can't remember them now. There's remove. So you remove products that you don't need from the market. So remove, for example, the plastic particles from cosmetic type products. That's a remove. And what we've done, we've redesigned, we've reduced material, we've removed stuff. What was the next one? Reuse. So you make products so you can reuse it. So the car industry is now doing that. So Renault is making cars which their idea is to make money, of course, is you'll lease a car, it'll go out, they'll recall it after so many years, and they'll rebuild it and make a new car out of it. So that's better than recycling the material. It's sort of recycling, but so that's reusing, and then there's recycling and recover. But I mean, one of the issues, on the plane coming over here, I was given 3 plastic cups of different liquids in. I was given a small cake in plastic. Someone was given a sachet with spoon and plastic spoon and sugar and all the rest of it. And that is KLM, which says, "Oh, we got this fantastic green agenda stuff." But all that stuff is all then has to be dealt with as waste. So if you can stop doing that, so it's the consumer thing. It's take your own mug to the coffee shop. It's all that sort of stuff, which is great. And if enough people do it, it starts to make a difference, and it starts to put pressure on companies to change, which I think is very important. But it's one of these things. There's a terminology which is called something can be either a simple problem, a simple solution. So the business with microbeads in cosmetics is a sort of simple problem. You can turn a tap and say, right, 2 years' time you're not going to use it. The rest of this is a wicked problem, and the terminology social science use. And it means there's no straightforward solutions. There will always be winners and losers. So if you stop people using plastic cups, the plastic cup producer will lose. There are multiple solutions, and there's no one is right. So it's a wicked problem, and most human problems are, But I think that's one of these fundamentals. The consumerism is it's like education and outreach. I haven't talked about it, but it's actually fundamental, and it's part of the circular economy idea. Actually, is essentially for the circular economy to work, you have to reduce consumption, and that's part of the philosophy, I think.
Thank you, Peter, for this thorough feedback and a thorough answer. Actually, I take it that there are no more requests for the floor from the plenary. I have a question to Saijariina, nevertheless, because I think what has not, at least from my experience from home, so to say, home, I mean from the ministry, this is not home yet, not yet. I think what we have learned and what the purpose of today's event here is the stakeholders. They have, really a responsibility in this process. They have something to contribute. It's not only so that we want to have them on board. Many of them want to be on board. They are already part of the system. Since you are a representative of one of those so-called NGOs in the system, do you have an overview, or could you perhaps just give us a brief overview about let's say, the NGO environment in Finland? I mean, what about activities there? Is there, apart from yours, we heard about that, Are there others, particular Finnish maybe also engaged? I mean, we know about WWF was probably acting around the world. Any particular contribution maybe from that field? What about the scenery there?
Well, that's actually quite a difficult question. We are mainly representing water utilities. And I have to say that when we talk about this marine litter issue or marine plastics or microplastics, we haven't been discussing this very much with other organizations. So it might be, as you already mentioned, environmental organizations which are working actively with this issue, but I'm not quite aware what is going on. It seems that at least if following the media, there are issues from media, but it's many times from other part of the world, these examples. So I think there is something that maybe NGOs could activate themselves with this issue.
Okay. Thank you for this feedback, and I'm absolutely sure that we have a lot of Finnish NGOs on board here, at least Finnish representatives of NGOs, so maybe we will even get a feedback during lunch break, whatever. Now, we are close to the end of this first half of the day, so to say, of the first session, actually, and when just trying to wrap up in a very, very abstract and in a very meta way, I think keywords which we heard in the morning is definitely, once again, we have that in so many processes, that is bridging science and policy, or bridging the gaps we have in terms of missing scientific evidence, missing research. But of course, we know enough to act. That must not be taken as an excuse to wait for the last scientific evidence. That is actually what I heard, at least between the lines, in different presentations here. Prevention is the key. I'm not able, Peter, sorry, to repeat the 6 R's, but I mean, tonight I start learning them by heart, because I think they really wonderfully explain and illustrate what the aim of our activities and our approaches must be. And the end of pipe is absolutely unacceptable. First of all, it's not cost efficient. Secondly, I at least had hoped when stepping into this process 25 years ago that the polluter pays, the prevention, whatever principle would be the one of the day, and I still insist on they are still valid, apart from GES or whatever we have nowadays. The last point, and that was actually the intention also when approaching with the last question here, is what has also been presented a lot of times is that all actors have a responsibility, and that goes for consumers like us up to industry, that goes from policy to NGOs involvement, that goes from voluntary whatever, fishing for litter activities, up to the United Nations regulatory process, whatever we need. IMO, FAO, the big ones, the big players, which we have named also. So, an issue, a challenge for all of us, a global issue. Nevertheless, if we come down to the region, and that is actually our task here and today, very particular problems and tailor-made solutions, but of course always in a kind of network, which more or less sooner or later should cover the whole globe then. I hope that this is more or less, at least in red lines, what we have achieved in the morning. I mean, there was one issue, I think the presentations, or I hope the presentations which have been given here this morning would be free for interested colleagues, for interested people. Maybe we can put them on the website, whatever, because I thought that in particular the 2 minutes slides, they were very informative, and they really give the right heat, the right steam on the machine, I think. Now I think for some of you maybe the best part of the day is approaching, and that is lunchtime. It is prepared, I have learned, on the same level here in the restaurant over there, but before eating, as we said in the morning, you should have a good shape and present yourself to the photograph. There will be the family photo, and I have also been asked to once more invite you, of course, it would be the better wording, to the exhibition which is around here. Colleagues have spent very many resources in presenting posters, whatever exhibition components, so it would be very nice, first of all, and probably very informative for you to give them maybe 5 to 10 to 15 minutes just to learn something more about what you heard here already in the morning. So the order is family photo, lunch, exhibition, and finally, after all, second part of this conference here, and that is to start at, now let me see, 1:45, right? Johanna is nodding, so I'm on the right track. We'll meet again at 1:45, and now, as I said, family photo, all this. Last but not least, thanks to those 4 panelists here. Thanks to the panel, to the presenters this morning. I hope that you will stay in the room, that you will participate in the second part of the conference as well, and will then give your valuable input maybe from the plenary in the second part of the day. Thanks a lot so far.